Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about Marxism today and why its ultimate aims are incompatible with Western civilization. Most educated people have a narrow concept of Western civilization. Most people with a liberal arts education have an incomplete, biased notion of a market-based economy, a biased notion of capitalism, and this has consequences on how they see Western civilization as a whole. This is partly because the very notion of Western civilization has been under assault in academia for decades. There's a notion that Adam Smith kind of just invented capitalism in the 18th century and all of a sudden wage labor and factories emerged. This is a Marxist perspective. It's not as wrong as it is incomplete. Marx's description of capitalism pushes off from feudalism and focuses on the difference between wage labor and serfdom. By comparing these two modes of production, Marx illustrates a concept he describes as socially necessary labor time, which is fundamental to his theory of value. Socially necessary labor time is a realization of a minimum threshold for the serf or wage laborer to produce the amount of value that is needed to sustain himself, as well as cover the cost of production. And by working beyond that threshold, the worker produces a surplus from which the lord or capitalist can exploit a profit from. So the distinction between wage labor and serfdom becomes the essential difference from which the Marxist notion of capitalism is constructed. Marxism therefore focuses on social relations as the defining feature of what is described as the mode of production, which could be based on serfdom, on slavery, on wage labor, or on collective ownership of the means of production. Now, there is value to this perspective, and it shouldn't be dismissed outright. Marx is, after all, an Enlightenment thinker that spent most of his time describing things as they are, as opposed to prescribing how things ought to be. Marxism is, however, a very narrow criteria to base your notion of capitalism on. Rather, if a liberal arts education wasn't so biased today, your notion of capitalism might begin with the ancient world. It could start with the property rights of ancient Greeks, the formation of currency, and other economic innovations would be layered on top of this over the course of history. The way bonds were invented to fund wars, the way Scottish clergymen developed the first insurance policies for widows, or the development of the corporation by the Dutch East India Company. These innovations arose from problems, from disputes and issues that needed to be settled. We have inherited a system of governance that is inextricably linked to this. Our civil liberties are inextricably linked to our property rights, to our economic system. If you want to have some kind of anarcho-syndicalist movement, then you need people to agree with you. If you impose your utopia on others, you trespass over their rights. Having a constitutional government, having a concept of the citizen, which also derives from the ancient Greeks, allows us to settle disputes peacefully and allows us to trade and coexist with other countries. The institutions that allow us to do this separate us from each other in order for us to meet on a separate plane where our interpersonal lives do not matter. When you engage in a market economy, your interpersonal relations do not matter. What matters is the money commodity and its commensurability to the goods and services that are exchanged with it. This is a form of alienation, and I will do a longer video on this very subject, but for now, the point I'd like to conclude with is that as modern Westerners, our freedom is bound up with our alienation. It is a freedom from the obligations of a religious or cultural sense of duty, a freedom to vote in elections. It is a freedom of consumer sovereignty. When you buy something in the market, who you are in relation to who you buy from should not matter. What matters is the honest accounting of exchange value. So when we engage in the market, we are alienated from other social obligations. This is part of our freedom. Our social relations are set up to preserve this alienation, this liberalism, this freedom. There is no room for utopian pursuits. If you are a communist, if you're a socialist or an anarcho-syndicalist, you need people to agree with you if their freedom is to be preserved in the pursuit of your utopia. The alienated state of the modern Westerner is a necessary condition for the individual to pursue his or her own ends. It is necessary for the self-determination of the individual in a world of different ideologies and cultures. Our laws are set up to create parameters for social relations. Our laws are set up to discourage tribalism. Our property rights, the way our judges are detached from the communities they adjudicate, the way they recuse themselves when they have a personal relation involved with the case. This is all set up to bind people together with larger ideas and duties that span beyond and transcend the parochialism of a local community. This is what makes having an expansive nation possible. This is what makes the Western world possible. This is why everyone wants to become a Westerner. And since we are alienated from each other by our institutions, it makes it difficult for individuals within the West to recognize what our civilization is based on. This is one of the reasons why Western values are deteriorating, because it is easy to take them for granted. The fact that we could sustain ourselves with cheap products created on the other side of the world means that it is difficult to form a sense of pride in the collective achievement of our civilization. It becomes difficult to find membership in larger society, which is spread thin across the entire globe. So when we engage in any kind of monetary transaction, we use the money commodity to mediate between production and consumption. Marx emphasized the way in which capitalism places material relations between people and people between material relations. What he meant was that when you buy something, you in a sense commission the exploitation of the labor responsible for its production. It happens out of sight, out of mind. The product stands between the social relation of producer and consumer. We don't have to confront the labor conditions involved with the products we buy. We do not know who made them. In order to acquire resources, we need a commodity that is both quantifiable and universal, a commodity that can be made commensurate to the abstract value we place on things. Marx is speaking of a feature of our alienation, and he is holding it responsible for the moral shortcomings of this collective estrangement from each other. His argument is fascinating. His descriptions of modern capitalism are in many ways accurate, but the prescriptions to address this condition often require everyone to think the same way, to come together and disavow themselves of private property while collectively appropriating everything else. Now, a Marxist may say that they did not consent to the social relations of modern capitalism, of Western civilization, that they don't agree with it, that this mode of production is being forced on them. And if you're going to force the social relations of capitalism on me, why shouldn't I be able to impose my economic and social beliefs on you? But the modern Westerner can reassure the Marxists that all is well, because our society, our civilization, is meant to endure individuals of varying points of view, individuals of different ideological persuasions. Our society is alienated from any one way of seeing things. So if you don't like capitalism, if you don't like the Western world, start a cooperative, work for a nonprofit, or join the military. And if you enjoyed this video, if you found it valuable in any way, please like and subscribe to my channel.